This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former Lieutenant Governor Dennis Wicker, John Hood from the John Locke Foundation, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and former Representative Connie Wilson, now lobbyist. The legislature is well into its third month and already more than 1,700 bills have been filed. Fewer than 35 have been passed by both houses. And we want to devote this week's NC Spin to the legislative session and some of the proposed legislation making its way through their General Assembly. Now, we're going to talk about specific bills, so I'm going to ask you to refrain from getting into particulars, but I want to ask each of you to give your assessment of this session, what's working, what isn't, what needs to be improved. John Hood, we'll start with you.
I'd have to say a spectacular start. Very entertaining, high broadcast ratings, even some national media, national television
coverage. No question about that.
That's what it's for, is to generate entertainment and high ratings, and it's doing the job.
Competing with Dancing with the Stars. Dennis, your evaluation.
Well, it was fun to watch the honeymoon. You know, the Republican Party had taken over the governor's mansion and the legislative leadership for the first time over 100 years. Now we're starting to see the cracks in that a little bit. You're seeing the House snipe at the Senate a little bit, the Senate back at the House, holding bills. The governor sort of over here. It sounds normal to me.
Connie?
You know, they started off extremely quickly. They had the Medicaid expansion bill that was up right off the bat. They had UI reform that passed very quickly. And then things slowed down because they got into the normal process. Mm-hmm. And we were told that we'd be out by the first week of June, and it looks like we may go later than that. Several hundred bills have been filed the last 2 weeks with
prior
the bill,
to the deadline.
With the bill filing deadlines popping up. They're filing a lot of bills. And with so many freshmen and sophomores, there are people just getting their sea legs. And you can see from January when they first came in to now, there's a definite increase in knowledge and awareness of what they need to be doing.
Chris?
Well, they might be getting their sea legs, but they're still making me nauseous.
Dramamine.
I think I need something when I go over there. I think a couple things. It's true that they got off to a fast start, but I actually think that was a mistake because I think we needed more public debate about Medicaid expansion, whether or not to do it. The unemployment thing, I think, was rushed through. What I'm struck by now is because there's over 100 members that have been there in their first or second term, they're still sort of careening all over the place. I mean, they have made national headlines, which has been entertaining, but it's also disturbing when the elected majority leader of the state house signs a resolution saying North Carolina isn't subject of decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, and a state senator made national headlines this week by telling members of the press, one member of the Press Association, I'm a senator, you are a citizen, sit down and be quiet. And I'm not sure that that's the image the Republicans necessarily wanted to portray.
Not good for re-election anyway.
I mean, I think there's a lot of pent-up sort of scores to settle and those sort of things, and they're sort of coming out of the woodwork, and I'm a little surprised the leadership hasn't sort of tampered that down some.
All right, well, let's get to some specific issues. We'll start with school reform. Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger has made public school reform one of the major thrusts of his tenure. Last year, he helped pass reform legislation that would, among other things, make it mandatory for a third grader to read at grade level before being promoted to the fourth grade. Now, he's proposed another round of reforms this year. They eliminate teacher tenure, replacing it with teacher contracts. It could be as long as 4 years. Reforms also focus on merit pay, school and teacher evaluations, and increased emphasis on reading instruction. In announcing the reforms, Berger says the days of accepting a broken education system in North Carolina are over. We must continue to demand better and positive change for our kids. John, you agree with Senator Berger our schools are broken? And if so, is eliminating teacher tenure going to fix them?
Well, I think that those schools fail to serve many students. Obviously, many other students do well in them, but many students don't. So for them, the system is broken. The Senate and the House are working on bills that aren't the same, but they sort of rhyme. And they have to do with teacher tenure, career status, and another major area where both bills address is grading schools, is communicating to parents and taxpayers how schools are doing. And in both cases, they've chosen similar but not the same ideas. For example, in the Senate, as you say, they want to replace the tenure, the career status, with a series of annual or multi-year contracts, depending upon the teacher and how long he or she's been in the job. The House wants to preserve tenure in a sense, but if teachers get a couple of years of poor results, then they lose it. So these are not radically different ideas, and I think they'll probably pass.
Dennis, you served on the State Board of Education for a number of years, as well as the Community College Board. There's so much discussion about teacher accountability. I don't hear a whole lot about principal accountability. Shouldn't we be talking more about that?
Well, absolutely. The principal is really the most important component part of teaching our kids. They are the CEO of each school, and I think what we seem to be missing in this whole debate is that a lot of the evaluation should be school-based, not individually based in terms of teachers. And the principal, as the CEO of each school, ought to be the one to pull the team together. It's a team effort. And I think educators will tell you that the principal is probably the most important person in the education
I
of the
had to
child.
save this question for you, Chris. Skip Stam from Wake County has proposed, he's back on his voucher bill again. He's proposing allowing parents up to $4,200 for each child to be able to use in the school of their choice. He says that the state's actually going to save money because we spend $6,700 per child in reality. Opponents say this is going to cripple the public schools. Proponents say this is a good deal. Where are you?
Well, I don't think this is a good idea, and we could disagree about what the studies show. I have yet to see a study showing that kids that get vouchers do better regardless of their economic station in life. It's interesting to me that Stam's bill, roughly half the kids in the second year will be current private school students. So we're giving money, public money, to kids already in private schools, so not going to save that much money. I do want to make one quick point about teachers, though. Two things about teachers. One is, remember we said on the show before, a teacher can work 15 years and just make $40,000 a year. That's one problem. The second problem is that Berger himself has said there are very few teachers he thinks are doing a poor job, so why is he penalizing all of them?
All right, Connie, I have to get to the proposal that was made this week to eliminate the restrictions on class size. What do you think of that?
The Republicans in both the House and Senate are looking for as many ways as possible to give flexibility to the local school systems. And their argument is this, local control is the most important. There isn't the increased funding is there, but if people can use at the local level their money that's unique for each one of their specific situations in the local community, that's the best way to use the tax dollars.
More discussion of legislation underway after these messages. If you enjoy keeping up with what's happening in North Carolina, you'll enjoy our website, ncspin.com, and NCSpin on Facebook. All during the week, our panelists and viewers sound off with their opinions of the week's events. So be a part of the conversation with ncspin.com or NCSpin on Facebook.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Our farmers are among the most productive in the world, even while lacking a stable and reliable agricultural workforce. But the workforce problems in agriculture have reached a breaking point, and food demand continues to rise. Reforms to the immigration system can ensure that farmers have access to the workers they need. The good news is that we still have time to fix this corrosive problem. Tell your congressional representatives that we need comprehensive immigration reform in 2013.
North Carolina is a great place to live, work, and raise a family, but we consistently rank in the bottom third for state health. Poor health choices and inactivity cost our state $54 billion a year, dollars that could be saved through healthier living. We can do better, North Carolina. That's why NC Spin is working with health and community organizations to launch a Healthier NC, an education campaign and challenge to live healthier lives. Join us at ahealthierNC.com.
Raffaldini Vineyards is Chianti in the Carolinas. Enjoy Italian-style wines, breathtaking views, cultural events, and much more. Visit raffaldini.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our discussion on legislation underway in our General Assembly. Even as the federal government appears to be reaching agreement on immigration, the battles rage within the states. North Carolina has about 325,000 undocumented immigrants in our state. Representative Harry Warren has introduced legislation that would allow each of them to get a legal driver's license, taking their fingerprints and doing a criminal background check at the same time. But his bill would also allow police to check the immigration status of anyone they arrest and detain them for 24 hours if there's a reasonable suspicion they're an undocumented immigrant. Question one to Connie. This bill seems not to please anybody. Many would say we're going to be protecting illegal immigrants and condoning them taking jobs our natural citizens should have. Others say this is just more Tea Party immigrant bashing to discover and harass immigrants. What do you think about it?
Usually in the General Assembly, if there's a bill that nobody's happy with, it's usually pretty close to being a decent bill.
Yeah.
Back in 2006, when the laws were changed, what came out because of 9/11 is that there were some of the terrorists had North Carolina licenses. And so the state really cracked down. This is actually a very important first step for these folk to be able to drive legally and have car insurance.
I was going to say, isn't this a good idea for these people to have licenses?
It is hurting their ability to really assimilate into society here, to be productive, and it helps everybody else who has driver's license who might end up in a car accident with them.
Now, Chris, this is a bill that's very similar to what the Supreme Court upheld in Arizona recently, is it not?
Well, they didn't uphold the whole thing. They upheld part of it, and I think some of this might be questionable. And I think that it's interesting to me that the Speaker appointed a special commission in the House to come up with some legislation on immigration. That commission met for several months and basically threw up its hands and didn't do anything. And then all of a sudden, now we see this bill by the guy, Harry Warren, who chaired that commission. I think driving privileges make a lot of sense. I think that, but it's a bargain with the devil to put an Arizona-style immigration law in the same bill. I don't think neither one of these will pass.
All right, let's move on. A bipartisan group of legislators is formulating legislation that would reform redistricting in our state following the 2020 census. The legislation would turn the redistricting task over to the legislative staff with instructions that districts be reasonably compact, respect political boundaries, and be based on population. Dennis, you've been involved in redistricting discussions before. Give us opinion of this legislation.
Well, I think while reform is I think needed, and certainly I think the independent commission to look at this would be a good idea, I think they might at the end of the day be disappointed because I think the legislature in itself, when they pass the redistricting plan, is going to pass what they want to pass in. And the party that's ruling, the party that's the majority, is going to skew it their way. For example, in the bill that's before us on the independent commission now, the appointments to that commission would be the governor, the leaders of the legislature. Well, guess what you're going to get? So I think they're going to be disappointed at the end, no matter how you try. It's always
turning it over to the legislative staff, John. Who do they work for?
Well, this is not an unprecedented idea. It's already done in Iowa. There may be some aspects of it that are hard to translate. The main one is that Iowa is not under the Federal Voting Rights Act. North Carolina, parts of North Carolina are. The most difficult thing to get to a formula is compliance with Voting Rights Act because people have strong disagreements about what compliance means. If you can resolve that, then you could do a nonpartisan redistricting. So
is anything going to happen, Chris?
Well, I think it's definitely going to pass the House. It passed the House with 88 votes last time. I think it's a good idea. There was a press conference this week with Speaker Pro Tem Paul Stam and Rick Glazier, bipartisan sponsors. The question is in the Senate, Deborah Ross and others. A lot of bipartisan folks there. It's definitely going to pass the House, but reportedly, Rules Chairman Apodaca and Bob Rucho in the Senate don't like the idea, even though Rucho sponsored it early in the 2000s.
All right, next topic. Background checks on welfare recipients. The House has approved and sent to the Senate a bill which would require anyone receiving welfare benefits from the state to have background checks to ensure they have no outstanding warrants or other violations. John, social service employees would be required to perform those checks and report them to law enforcement officials. Is this going to require more work on their part and their departments?
Well, I assume so, unless they're going to just sort of do a half-baked job. There's some more work. I'm wondering how hard it will be to get the records on MetLife company executives and to see if we can check their backgrounds and any other recipients of corporate welfare, which I assume is what they're talking about.
I don't think that was exactly the tone of what they were talking about. Dennis, Democrats say this bill singles out people and essentially distrust them. Advocates say it ensures that we're not going to be giving our benefits to people who shouldn't be receiving them. Where do you stand?
Well, I'm with my friends on it.
Yeah, I hear you.
No, really.
You have friends on both sides, and you're standing with your friends.
I really don't have a problem with the background checks, quite frankly. I think it's something that when they're taking public money, you want to make sure that there's not outstanding warrants. That makes sense to me. It seems to. I think that how you use that information and whether it's accurate information is the most important thing.
Connie, is the Senate going to pass this?
The Senate has filed similar bill, and it will definitely pass.
I do think John makes a point. He's being facetious, but we have this bill. We have a bill in the House and the Senate, I'm sorry, that would do drug testing if you get public benefits, even though the drug testing, drug use is lower among people in Florida that get public benefits. But if we're going to do this, everybody who gets welfare or everybody who gets a government subsidy or a tax credit, why are we just picking on poor folks? I think that's a legitimate question.
Well, we can receive benefits here, too. I'll do a background check. When we come back after these messages, we're going to talk about lobbyist gifts.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Not all high school graduates go to college. Not all employers need college graduates. Are North Carolina's public schools preparing graduates with the skills employers need now? Join the discussion. Visit nceducate.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Following some of the abuses of politicians, especially the Jim Black scandal of 2006, the legislature passed laws that prohibited lobbyists from getting any gifts to lawmakers. Representative Robert Brawley has proposed lifting those bans and allowing lobbyists to buy meals and provide gifts to elected officials. Brawley, who has been out of the legislature for a long time and has just recently come back in, says he thinks politicians are ethical and these bans are an impediment to the exchange of ideas and information. Connie, a lot of people think the current ban has worked pretty well. Is there sufficient justification for it to be lifted?
I don't think there's strong interest in lifting the ban. I think from a PR perspective, there'd be a lot of problems. I think many of the legislators would appreciate being able to go out to dinner. Most folk don't know they only make 14.
Sullivan's Steakhouse would appreciate it also.
Most their business did go down for a while, I think. But I will tell you one of the nice things, because I was in there when Robert Brawley was there before, and being able to, let's say a committee was taken out or a group of folk, many times it was bipartisan, and it gave people an opportunity to get to know each other outside the General Assembly in a very combative mode. So I actually believe in many ways it helped to bring some civility to the crowd.
Chris, how's this going to be received by the general public?
I hope miserably. I think this is an awful idea. You know, they make $14,000 a year, but they also get a per diem every day that includes money for meals. And if legislators want to go out to eat together, there's nothing preventing them. But for goodness sakes, do we want to go back to the days when literally a lobbyist credit card was on file at restaurants and the lobbyists would just, they would just say, oh, put this on Lobbyist Smith's card? I don't think that's the way we need to do business.
So is it going to pass, John?
I doubt it. I think if you ever wanted to do anything in this area, you might just clarify. There are actually some people who have trouble with this law, but it's not about buying lawmakers meals. It's about, handing out pieces of information. Got to make sure it's educational. Well, if it's too entertaining, it's not informational.
Like your stuff's entertaining but not informational.
Exactly. This is the problem. I need to have my stuff legal. So
Speaking of entertaining, let's move to the next subject. We can't talk about legislative action without discussing the Asheville water system. The House has passed and sent to the Senate a bill which would take away the Asheville water system from the city of Asheville and place it in a metropolitan sewer district. Now, there's been argument about controls of this water system for many years, and in 2005, Asheville actually pulled out of a cooperative district and has operated the water system alone. Chris, this water system serves nearby communities, and the proponents say it should be operated by these communities. Asheville, however, is not going to be compensated for their investment. Is it a good or bad bill?
Well, I think it's a bad idea. I'm still not clear on the real reason for it, and it's being introduced or pushed by Representative Tim Moffitt, who's actually just represents Asheville and Buncombe County. He doesn't represent the communities who were upset, which is a little interesting. Asheville has made big investments in this. I think the General Assembly really doesn't need to be in this business of telling Asheville what to do with its water system.
Dennis, I think one of the things that is bothering a lot of people about this bill is that it has been made broad enough to the point where any community that had a water system could be forced into having a water district.
Well, and in the essence of disclosure, I'm working with Asheville on this bill. But I will tell you, I think that's the core of the problem, Tom, is there are now all the towns and municipalities out there and even counties that are investing in infrastructure for the legislature to come in and swoop down and say, we're going to take your water system, we're going to take your park, or we're going to take your airport or whatever, and move it over here to a non-elected authority that's going to have the power to tax and borrow. I just don't think that's good policy, and I'm hoping that the General Assembly on the Senate side will see the wisdom of not passing the bill.
So, John or Connie, is it going to pass?
I think it has a pretty good chance.
You think so?
It wasn't that too many years ago, some of the same people opposing this bill were talking about how it's important to do everything regionally. Water and sewer is particularly an issue that needs to be done regionally. And in much of the state, there have been voluntary cooperative compacts worked out, or even authorities created voluntarily. This is a case where people around Asheville think Asheville's been taking their money and not spending it properly.
All right, more legislative action after these messages.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina is a great place to live, work, and raise a family, but we consistently rank in the bottom third for state health. Poor health choices and inactivity cost our state $54 billion a year, dollars that could be saved through healthier living. We can do better, North Carolina. That's why NC Spin is working with health and community organizations to launch a Healthier NC, an education campaign and challenge to live healthier lives. Join us at ahealthierNC.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Back to our consideration of what's going on this legislative session. Senator Neil Hunt has proposed that the speed limits on interstate highways and controlled access roads be raised from 70 to 75 miles an hour if DOT recommends it appropriate. Hunt says the increased limit will help move traffic along, and 16 other states have similar limits. Connie, what's your response to increasing the speed limits on our interstates?
I think it makes sense. It gives authority to DOT to make that decision, and maybe I can get to some of my meetings on time. I'm usually a couple minutes late.
As far as it goes, Chris, it's pretty common knowledge that people exceed the speed limits regardless of what happens to be posted. In fact,
but I do think that people use the speed limit at least as some kind of guide. And at some point, it is true statistically that the faster you go, the more likely you are to die if there's an accident or be seriously hurt. At some point, we can't have 100 miles an hour speed limit. And some of the states that have higher speed limits are Utah or states, Wyoming, that have very few people and long, flat roads. I think we need to be careful about this.
Is it going to pass, John?
I think it has a good chance. Many of these interstates were actually engineered for that speed.
All right, I want to close our show by asking what we can expect in the remaining days of the legislative session. Obviously, the biggest requirement before this legislature is to pass a state budget in time to go in effect to the start of the fiscal year. Connie alluded to the fact that they were moving along those lines. Dennis, what are your expectations? Are they going to get this budget passed in time for July 1?
I think they will. I think they'll pass the budget by first week of June, maybe the middle of June, and they'll have a budget by the first of June.
So the House takes the first turn at it this time, and then it goes to Senate.
No, the Senate goes the first time, and then it goes to the House.
Okay.
The House then passes.
All right. Now, tax reform is been talked about all throughout the session. We've anticipated a lot about that. Is a tax package going to be part of this revenue, Connie?
It won't be necessarily part of the budget, but the leadership in both chambers and the governor's office have made the assumption that it's going to be a revenue neutral package, so it doesn't have to pass at the same time. Mm-hmm. And you will definitely see plans coming from both chambers that will be seriously considered.
John, what are you hearing about tax reform?
I think tax reform may end up being, it doesn't have to be revenue neutral, might be a net tax cut of at least a modest amount, which means it would be part of the budget conversation, but they're further apart on tax reform than they are on the budget plan.
What's your anticipation, Chris?
Oh, I think that's right. I think it's a little harder. I wouldn't be shocked if tax reform was held over to the short session, but something might pass each chamber. I'm not sure they can resolve it and get out of town in an efficient way. I've even heard a couple of rumors this past week of I don't think it'll happen, but there's some discussion of coming back and doing that in a special session.
I've heard that too.
So far as it goes, there's several other big initiatives that Governor McCrory has been proposing. You got Medicaid reform, Department of Commerce, some DOT funding formula reforms and other DOT reforms. What do you think they're going to be undertaking in these last few weeks?
I think on commerce that they'll get something done before they go home this session. On Medicaid reform, that's a big one to chew and bite off and chew. I really think that one's going to be more long term. That'd be my guess.
So if it doesn't get addressed this session, Connie, is it going to go over to the short session?
Well, what
happens to it?
From Medicaid reform, you'd probably see a study commission studying it and trying to garner support within the General Assembly and answering questions that might be there.
Well, where does that leave Governor McCrory and Secretary Voss?
Well, it leaves them without the option to be able to go out there and hire managed care companies to come in and help, provide some services for Medicaid. I think another reform that may be considered, I work for the Orthopedic Association, but CON reform is gaining steam in the House, and I believe you'll see that up for a vote in the next few weeks.
Chris, 30 seconds. Any other big initiatives you think we're going to have coming out of this legislative session?
You mentioned it earlier in the show. I do think there'll be a big debate about school privatization or school choice, depending on which terms you use. I think that it'd be interesting to see how they resolve I think there's a little bit more different than John says, a teacher tenure, teacher career status. I think that'll be a little more controversial than you
John,
think.
any other big initiatives?
I agree. Those two big education issues, school choice as a legislation originating in the House, and the House and Senate bills on public school reforms will be big lifts this year, and I think that they'll at least get votes in both chambers.
So we should end up with a very interesting session.
Absolutely.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give us your feedback and read our weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. We hope you'll join us next week. We're going to have a special show for you featuring mayors from North Carolina talking about how they view this legislature. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.